Ya podemos empezar, Ricardo.
Muy bien. Bueno, algunos tardes, algunos todavía va a ser en la mañana. Para mí es un honor presentar al profesor Paul Cockshott a nombre del Centro de Investigación Regional en Ciencia Política y Ciencias Sociales de la carrera de Ciencia Política y Administración Pública de la Universidad Autónoma Gabriel René Moreno. El profesor Cockshott es economista por la Universidad de Manchester y doctor en Ciencias de la Computación por la Universidad de Edimburgo. Ha desarrollado su carrera académica e investigadora en la Universidad de Glasgow en economía política. Es reconocido mundialmente por sus trabajos en teoría del valor trabajo, ¿no? Econofísica clásica y sobre todo en teoría de la planificación económica, campo en el que es una de las principales autoridades a nivel internacional. Entre sus libros destacan el ya clásico Towards a New Socialism de 1993, Classical Econophysics, perdón, de 2009, Computation and Its Limits de 2012 y How the World Works de 2017. Obras que han renovado el debate sobre las alternativas al capitalismo de mercado y sobre el papel de la computación en la organización económica. Hoy tenemos el privilegio de escucharlo en la conferencia magistral, una crítica a Hayek, donde abordará precisamente estos debates sobre información, planificación y socialismo desde un... Muchísimas gracias por aceptar nuestra invitación, por compartir su trabajo con nosotros. In English, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honor for me to introduce Professor Paul Cockshott on behalf of the Regional Research Center. Professor Cockshott is an economist from the University of Manchester and holds a PhD in computer science from the University of Edinburgh. He has developed his academic and research career at the University of Glasgow in political economy. He is widely known for his work on the labor theory of value, classical econophysics, and especially on the theory of economic planning, a field in which he is regarded of, as one of as leading authorities in, worldwide. His books include uh, the now classic Towards a New Socialism, Classical Econophysics, Computation and Its Limits, and How the World Works. Today we have the privilege of listening to him in keynote lecture, a critique of Hayek, where he will address these debates on information, planning, and socialism from an empirical and computational perspective. Professor Cockshott, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for sharing your work with us. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. The subject I'm talking on is based on an article that Alan Cottrell and I wrote in the mid-1990s when I wrote it whilst I was on sabbatical. We wrote it whilst I was on sabbatical with him in Wake Forest University, and I was working at the Turing Institute in Glasgow. And if you want the original paper, I've got the details there on the screen. So it's about information and Hayek. Just before that, we had published Towards a New Socialism. And we found that the reaction of people who read it was to say we were relying on the labor theory of value, which surely had been refuted long ago. And surely experience had taught us that economic planning didn't work. So even people who were relatively critical of neoliberal economics, like Stiglitz. He was saying, as for a central planned economy, Hayek had rightly criticized the Marxian project, arguing that the central planner could never have the requisite information. This was a fairly typical response. Even economists who didn't subscribe to Hayek, like Stiglitz, nevertheless believed that Hayek's critique of central planning had proven definitive. Hayek had said that the economic problem was securing basic use of resources for societal purposes, which is fair enough. But he said this is often understood due to naturalism or scientism, which transfers the methods of natural science to social phenomena. Now, we're against his characterization of scientism. Hayek claimed he was different from socialists just over whether planning should be centrally handled or divided among individuals. If it's divided among individuals, he said, that involves market coordination where decentralized planning occurs. And the question of whether one is more efficient than the other depends on whether a central authority can efficiently distribute knowledge. What he said is the problem of maximizing the use of available means is a logic problem, requiring complete knowledge of available means and a system of preferences. The solution must satisfy certain conditions, equal marginal rates of substitution between commodities or factors. However, this is not, he says, the economic problem, as the given data is not given to, as the data used is not given to a single mind, and the knowledge of the circumstances is dispersed among individuals. Now, the first paragraph here at the top, he's basically giving the neoclassical definition of the economic problem, which people like Langer said was solvable. And he's saying, no, that's not the problem. Now, if you go back to the socialist calculation debate in the 1930s, 20s and 30s, the debate was really between neoclassical socialists and Hayekians. Marxists didn't get involved. Neoclassical economists argued that individual preferences were part of the problem. That's not what Marxists would argue. We say that the practical problem is aligning production potential with social need patterns through democratic political decisions and through aggregate consumer purchases. Aggregate, not individual. Now, I said before, Hayek was critical of what he called naturalism or scientism, because he distinguished between scientific knowledge and unorganized knowledge, which he said was specific knowledge of circumstances of time and place. He admitted that scientific knowledge can be centralized through a body of experts, but he denied this was the case of unorganized knowledge, and it can only be used with individual or active cooperation. And as examples, Hayek gives the specific localized knowledge used by shipping clerks and arbitrageurs. And he argues this knowledge is often undervalued by those who view scientific knowledge as general or paradigmatic. He's saying that if economic planning could be laid down in advance and closely adhered to, the task of creating a comprehensive plan would be less daunting. But he claims this isn't the case. If it were the case that relevant changes only occur rarely and at discrete intervals, he concedes that managing productive systems would be mechanical and doable. But he says this isn't always the case. He says that cost control in competitive industries involves you making daily decisions which are made in the light of unpredicted circumstances, and that central planning can't account for these circumstances, necessitating decisions made on the spot. Now, obviously, this is very dated. It's before detailed, specific international supply chains with just-in-time delivery existed. It would make no sense to be making those assertions now, given the amount of planning that the firms have to undertake in order to set up these supply chains. He says that the adjustments produced via the price system are not perfect, but they're a marvel of economic coordination. And the price system, he says, is a form of division of labor that has allowed coordinated resource allocation based on equally divided knowledge, and that there is no alternative system that preserves the efficiency of the existing capitalist system, such as individual freedom, choosing pursuits, and people using their own knowledge and skills. Well, this is an assertion made in the 30s, and it was had a certain apparent credibility when the Soviet Union had just collapsed. But had it been the case that simply creating the market as a method of allocation was the key, then the shock therapy that Yeltsin carried out would have worked. Switching to the market would have should, according to Hayekian theory, have brought a big increase in economic efficiency, and the economy of the former Soviet Union should have raced ahead. It should have achieved higher rates of growth than it had before. But we know, of course, the opposite was the case. It collapsed. Now, the arguments I'm going to put forward will use ideas from computing, which weren't around in Hayek's day. But the Hayekians haven't dropped Hayek because of computing taking place, and they continue reproducing his arguments. So I think it's fair to deploy modern ideas from cybernetics and from information theory in facing up to him. He's a subjectivist. He says there's an irreducible subjective element to social science. And he says that society can only be understood in terms of men's conscious actions, and that this is different from natural science, and it imposes a dichotomy between the study of nature and the study of society, where in the study of nature, he says, it's reasonable that scientists can have all the relevant information, whereas in a social context, this isn't the case. Well, that is a highly suspect thing. I mean, as historical materialists and economic physicists, we agree that market economies have unintended outcomes. But we think that explaining these in terms of consciousness is irrelevant, because the whole system is still subject to aggregate statistical laws, and these laws are independent of individual human consciousness. And the complexity arises from the number of degrees of freedom the system has. But the existence of statistical law-governed behavior in systems with a high degree of freedom, high number of degrees of freedom, has been studied by natural science since the late 19th century. So that is not a distinction between natural science The fact that capitalist systems are semi-chaotic is not fundamentally different from natural science. Turbulent flows, for example, are chaotic. They have a large number of degrees of freedom. In natural science, it's common to deal with things which are non-linear. Even Newtonian dynamics of the planetary system is dealing with non-linear equations. Gravity is non-linear with distance. And weather forecasting and climate modeling is constantly have to dealing with systems where information is partial. The information about the current weather is partial. Detailed long-term prediction is not possible. But that doesn't mean that science gives up. In the short term, weather forecasting is remarkably accurate. And also in the really long term, you can make strong predictions. You can make strong predictions about the general temperature levels as a consequences of changes of carbon dioxide. These are strong predictions which are statistical. They don't say what the weather will be like in a particular town on a particular day in 2050, but it does say what will happen on average. But you can make similar strong predictions about capitalism. As Marx says, the wealth of capitalist society presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities. And you can go beyond that to say it's an immense accumulation of commodities such that the correlation between prices and labor values will, for example, exceed 0.85. If you look at economies, this is a statistical law, which is a statistical regularity which Marx acknowledged and which empirical statistics bears out. Another critique we have of his subjectivist standpoint is that the rational subject is not a given category. It's not a category of neuropsychology. If you read Dennett's Consciousness Explained, you'll see that people act first and then become aware of their intentions to act. Human behavior is highly routinized, coordinated by unconscious brain functions. And in economics, the subjects that matter are not individuals. They're the juridical subjects, firms. And these firms make decisions based on complex practices, reviews, accounting procedures, and decisions that involve a large group of people working according to rules. Now, in the early stages of capitalism, the distinction between people and juridical subjects was unclear, since the agent of economic practice appeared to be the individual capitalist or entrepreneur. In the current stage of economic development, the rational calculating subject is the property maximizing firm. And bourgeois economics then takes this economic subject, which is a juridical subject, and projects that onto individuals and makes individuals models of the bourgeois firm. And this is something we talk about in our new book, Defending Materialism. His standpoint is based on subjective ideas, and this subjectivism is crucial to his arguments against socialist planning. Despite scientific information theory having been established in the 1940s, Hayek's notion of information remains pre-scientific. The objectivity of information has since revolutionized all sorts of things, from biology, major industries, social industries, obviously the computational industry, artificial intelligence, greatly invalidating Hayek's argument. Hayek thinks that information is something subjective in people's minds. And according to him, the problem is to get dispersed subjective information, something that's inherently part of the mind, to work for the common good. And doing so, he overlooks the fact that economic practice always depends on technical supports. Information cannot be processed without technical supports. And techniques for objectifying information have been critical for stabilizing relationships, right back to landlord-tenant relationships. You couldn't have landlord-tenant relationships without written records, a means of recording tenancy and contracts. Now, in modern science, information is something objective. It can exist in terms of the order of a system or disorder of a system. It can exist in DNA, in binary code, in radio waves, electronic signals, but it's always a configuration of matter. It's not something subjective. Now, another theme of Hayek is the director, the single mind that is supposed to have in the single person who's supposed to have in their mind all the details of an economy. But that's never been the objective of socialists. Instead, they want to replace market information processing with planning. Now, planning is an organized process done by a collectivity of people and computing devices and computing technologies. If you go to the days of Gosplan in the Soviet Union, it only employed some thousands of people, but it certainly didn't just employ one person. And the information wasn't in someone's mind. It was in ledgers, paper and pencil spreadsheets, typed letters and reports, etc. His idea of concentrating information in a single mind really echoes back to pre-civilized conditions. The development of economic administration from Sumeria and Egypt always went hand in hand with means of recording information, writing systems and number systems. Now, the human mind was used in the actual process of writing things down. But the information then became embodied. And this information, embodied information, represented the physical quantities of goods being moved around. He claims that distributed knowledge, like those of arbitrageurs and shipping clerks, the local knowledge, was inherently impossible to coordinate by any means other than the market. But paradoxically, this was the very first area that computerized automation took hold of. Booking airline bookings, booking shipping things. These were automated way back in the 1960s. This is a picture of me and my co-author, Greg Michelson, with our first home computer. It was actually a surplus computer from the Boadicea first airline booking system. And that we bought it for a few pounds in the late 70s. But it was dealing with the kinds of knowledge which Hayek claimed only a shipping clerk could hold in his mind. But even 1960s technology was able to handle that. By modern technology, this was a ridiculously primitive machine with 8 kilobytes of information, and you had to program it in binary with those buttons on the top. Now, let's go for more modern aviation industry. Consider Airbus building the A340. There's nobody who knows how to build an A340. Everything in terms of the component database is mechanized. The construction processes are all spelled out in online manuals. The quality control processes are specified and monitored online. None of it is held in a person's mind. It is all an organized system of information processing. When you look at the economic calculation, there are three aspects to it in a capitalist society. Modeling the real flow of goods, that has to be done. Modeling property relations, and examining different potential uses of goods. And it's the last one that neoclassical and Hayekian economics lays its emphasis on. But in fact, the first of these, modeling the real flow of goods, using bills of lading, using order forms, delivery notes, these are absolutely essential to the system working. And all these can be done just as well in a planned socialist economy. On the other hand, if you interrupt the flow of this information, as happened when they got rid of Gosplan and centralized orders in the Soviet Union, then the economy collapses. This is the flow of information relating to the material flow of goods. On top of that, there's the flow of information relating to property relations, to claims over goods. Documents relating to this are invoices, checks, receipts, financial accounts. These are information flows that are specific to preserving the existing set of property relations. And that form of information flow isn't needed in a socialist system. Now, finally, there is looking at the different potential uses of goods. Now, the variation in potential uses of goods is not a property of the real economy. It's a property of the possible economies. And when you get right-wing theorists saying that economic planning is impossible, they're saying it's impossible because they specify a search space which involves all possible economies. But there's no way any real system can compute over all things that are possible. A real economy's evolution involves some kind of noisy search procedure. It describes a trajectory through a phase space, which is influenced by individual agents' trajectories. And at best, the system acts as a single analog processor, theoretically, according to the bourgeois economists, with the price vector determining its position in economic space. And this is going to be a very slow process because it has a slow cycle time, because information transmission is tied to real movement of goods, building real resources, and these going into production and then influencing the price. So it performs a single-threaded search in computing terms through its state space, and the adjustments are slow. because they're limited by the speed of movement of actual real capital investment. But this is different from what, in principle, you can do in a socialist system, because in a planned economy, supercomputers can perform searches through the space of possible economic configurations to come up with an optimum. And the interconnection between sectors is pre-modeled before the first ground is cut for new plant. Now, let's look at the adequacy of the information system that he's talking about. He says the prices are an efficient means of transmitting information, but we argue it's a very lossy channel and markedly inferior to pre-computing the actions that are going to take place with the plan. How much information is stored in prices? Well, if you look at actual prices, you see they're given usually to 2 to 3 digits. For instance, in this set of prices, which I just took from a set of adverts, the supermarket seems to round the prices to 25 pence. And you can easily encode these in 8-bit numbers. Sorry, where I should have a picture of that. Yes, it's at the bottom here. You can encode them in what's now the B float format, where you've got 8 bits of precision and 8-bit exponent. So let's see how much information is involved. Alibaba is supposed to have 200 million products, Amazon 600 million. But there's a lot of duplication here. And Amazon's own list without duplicates is 12 million. So let's say an upper bound of around 100 million. We can confirm that by saying, okay, China is the biggest industrial economy in the world with some 900 million workers. But since each product requires several people to make it, and many people do the same task, 100 million is of the right order of magnitude, okay? 100 million products. How much data is that? Well, you can store 100 million prices on a 256 megabyte SD card, really tiny by modern standards. It's not much. And is this enough to run an economy? No. If you start looking at other ways of examining economy, like what Leontiev did, who worked on planning in the USSR before he moved to the USA, he developed input-output tables. And he represents the economy as a matrix. Each industry has a row and a column. A row specifies where outputs come from, and the column where outputs go to. And as the position XY says how much of output Y was used in industry X. If there are n products here, there are obviously n squared cells in the matrix. So if we take the Chinese economy and say there are 10 to the 8 products, the matrix would have 10 to the 16 cells. Now, that is a huge amount. It's tens of petabytes. And it's just about feasible on the latest server clusters from Google and people like that. But it's only just becoming feasible. But actually, you don't need that much. This is something we emphasize in our writings, that actually real I/O matrices are largely filled with zeros. And they can therefore be much more efficiently stored using what are known as sparse matrix techniques. We've done studies of how many zeros you get in I/O tables as they're successively aggregated from a highly disaggregated IO table, because the United States publishes IO tables broken into several thousand products. And if you successively join pairs of products together, you can see how the number of zeros declines, percentage of zeros declines as the number of products decline. And the the upper bound on it is something of the order of n log n. And this actually is a figure which comes off from Erdos as well in graph theory, that you need n log n to have a connected random graph. But the important point is you can't encode an n by n matrix in only n prices. You can't record the economy's state in its price structure. So the price form is inadequate for its claimed purpose. It can't encode the information it's supposed to represent. It can represent something of dimension n, for instance, the amount of labor required to make things, and that will act as the attractor for prices. But the point is that a change in final price hides its cause. It could be due to a technical change in any of a large number of commodity inputs, or technical change in any one of a large number of sectors using it. And current price levels can thus give misleading signals. With an IO table, a detailed IO table, planners can avoid this. Now, the Chinese make extensive use of input-output tables in drawing up their 5-year plans. And they've done a very good job of having balanced sectoral economic growth going on year after year after year. I'm not sure whether it's worth doing this. Basically, I have a worked example using a simple IO table showing how if you take the most parsimonious assumptions about elasticity of demand, etc., the prices you get are misleading in the short term. I don't think I'm going to work through this because basically I'm showing if you make small random changes to an IO table, the first order prices you get, assuming a market with a unit elasticity of demand, will be misleading in terms of the long-term stable prices. But it's not worth going into that. You get it under very parsimonious, simple assumptions. Unit elasticity of demand, constant returns to scale, random changes. Okay. Why is this relevant? Well, it's replaying an old result, in a sense, Sraffa's result, when he showed that the assumptions of neoclassical economics break down when you have a matrix structure of production. Sraffa's writing after Leontiev, and the main difference in the formalism is that he uses basically a transpose matrix compared to Leontiev's matrix. And it's significant that Mises and Hayek and the Austrian school either explicitly or implicitly consider only feed-forward flows of products. There is no serious study of the graph theoretic structure of production. And there's no excuse for this because von Neumann had introduced this in the 1930s in his theory of balanced economic growth. So it was around at the time that Hayek was writing. If you've got a spreadsheet, you can readily compute the correct values Why is this relevant? Because the law of value is predicated on the fact that labor is mobile. People can be moved between different branches of production. Now, this occurs in a capitalist economy with noise and incorrect initial moves. But with computerized planning, it's possible to compute what the correct prices should be and what resources allocations would be needed to achieve that. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now. Hello?
Hello, doctor.
Yeah. That I don't know whether that was 45 minutes. Yes, it was 43 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I have three questions of
Yeah.
your public. The first one, Fernando Rodriguez. Hayek saw competition not as a state of equilibrium, but as a dynamic process of discovering how can a planet system, which aims to achieve a pre-calculated optimal allocation of resources, replicate the role of entrepreneurial profit and loss in getting the constant, decentralized experimentation that drive genuine innovation and progress. The question is in the chat for your view.
Okay. The point is that a large part of the information adjustment that Hayek is concerned with is adjustment that occurs as part of the internal noise of the system, of the fluctuation of prices. The actual long-term improvement in technology on which the economy depends isn't due to entrepreneurship. It's due to long-term planning of what new techniques are going to be brought in. The long-term planning that's required to design, build, and set up the supply chains for a new model of aircraft. The long-term planning that's required to set up a new chip manufacturing technology for TSMC, for example. These are not decisions taken by entrepreneurs. They're decisions taken by thousands of engineers collaborating. And it's these technological advances in aviation, high bandpass turbofans, large marine diesels, semiconductors, on which the growth of the world economy has depended. It's these large shifts in technology
Thank you, doctor. Second question, Ramiro Buenafuente. Ultimately, Hayek's critique of socialist planning was encapsulated in his concept of the fatal concept. The belief that human reason can design a social order superior to one that has evolved over a generation, isn't the entire project of computationally modeling and planning an entire economy based on labor value a prime example of this fatal arrogancia?
Well, I don't think there's any difference. I mean, the establishment of capitalist economic relations was a political project which went hand in hand with capitalist political economy from Adam Smith onwards. And if there's a fatal conceit, the same can be applied to that. It didn't evolve spontaneously. It evolved as direct state policy. That's why it's called political economy. And this state policy involved changing property relations, changing the actions of the state, etc. There is not a contrast between the two. They're both political projects.
Okay. The last one, doctor. You critique monetary calculation as being misleading. However, Hayek argued that money and price aren't indispensable telecommunication system for a complex economy by proposing to replace them with non-transferable labor credits. Are you not eliminating the most effective means for individuals to make their own economic calculation and express the intensity of their diverse preference?
No, because people can choose to spend their labor credits on whatever goods they want. This is the principle that Marx set out in the Critique of the Gotha program. You work, you're credited for your work, and then you choose what products of labor you're going to consume. And the planning authorities know from the state wholesalers how much of each product is being consumed and can adjust the output to meet that. There is no restriction on how you spend the proceeds of your labor.
Thank you, Dr. Ricardo.
Good. Thank you very much, Professor Coxon, for this clear and thought-providing lecture, and for sharing your work and your time with us. We will also like to thank you for your attention, for your question, and your active participation. We hereby conclude this keynote lecture, a critique of Hayek, and invite you to join us in our upcoming academic events. Thank you very much and have a very good afternoon.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
Doctor. Listo.